So the paper Florian is going to talk about is probably out of all the papers in the literature, the one that comes closest to really nailing the mechanisms behind peer effects. I think in some ways, all the other papers that we've seen so far, they're, despite sort of many of them having these ingenious research designs, in the end they're observational studies. And so even with very good research designs, when you're primarily focusing on on sort of data that's already collected ex post, you have indications about whether or not you think it's a social utility or a social information story or something like that. But I think this paper is really an example to me of where, if you want to nail that question perfectly, you almost need to design your own experiment, and you need to sort of be very clever about it in sort of the various ways that Florian will talk about. So I think in terms of this question about sort of what are the different mechanisms that play a role, I think this is really sort of, a great paper, both because I think, it nails the mechanism in a specific setting, through experimental work, but also because I think sometimes sort of these very cleverly thought out experiments also help me think through the types of pieces of evidence I would be looking for in observational data too. Right. So when you figure out, and as you sometimes see this when people are presenting empirical work, they'll ask the question, well, what would be the ideal experiment I'd want to run if I wanted to figure this out? And then, you can try and figure out the extent to which, your observational data approximates that ideal experiment. And sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. But I do think like having someone else sort of go through that work and think through what exactly would the ideal experiment look like, beyond then actually implementing it, I think it helps me sort of work through, what are sort of things that you would expect to see if it were mainly social utility or social information. So with that, Florian, we're looking forward to your presentation. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you very much, Johannes, and thank you very much who came to listen to me talk, and thank you also to the co-panelists. I learned a ton of interesting things as I listened along. The title of what I want to talk to you about today is Mechanism of Peer Effects. That should have been the title of the paper that we wrote. Instead, we have one of the most boring and long-winded titles that I've ever come across. It goes something like understanding blah, 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 mechanisms of peer effects, yada, yada, yada. It's a very informative title because it tells you everything, but it's also incredibly boring. So really what we should have named it back then was Mechanisms of Peer Effects. But we were junior researchers who just wanted to make sure that we are like as humble as possible. I've shed some of that humility, unfortunately, nowadays, and now people claim that I write like short, catchy titles that are basically clickbait. So this is the clickbait title that I would have given the paper if I were to write it today. This is joint work with my three fabulous co-authors back then, who were also my close friends, Leo Burstein, particularly at UCLA, and then Noam Juchtman, who was at the time at UC Berkeley, and Bruno Furman, who was in Brazil at the time. He was a fellow MIT PhD. We're all about the same cohort at MIT and Harvard at the time, and Leo and I were faculty colleagues together at UCLA, so that was really instrumental. We talked a lot about these things, and in fact, we talked a lot about movies. And one of the movies that at some point we talked about was this movie called The Joneses, which, for those of you who know it, it's all about sort of how the consumption behavior of others influences what you do, and in fact, how that is harnessed by people. And Leo, he particularly got very interested in that whole strand, so he followed it up with really interesting research on peer effects in education and how the visibility of educational achievement really affects people differently. We were really there trying to nail that mechanism. So we started out this project wanting to understand what is the mechanism through which these peer effects take place. And in particular, the two competing things that the literature had sort of hinted at were social utility on the one hand and social learning on the other hand. And both of them sort of show up a little bit in that the Joneses movie, the social utility one, where they get envious that where the neighbors get envious that the other people drive like a really fancy car. And the other one is sort of more of a social learning one. As they learn about these cool products that the other family is using, they also want to use those too. So in general, as people have previously already mentioned, you know, peer effects play a big role. I often show when I teach this paper to my MBA students, I put up this quote from Josh Angrist in his review piece on peer effects. He talks about how he smoked a lot of dope in high school, and suddenly all his friends also smoked a lot of dope, but somehow all of that was gone. And of course, one couldn't easily infer from that 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 was all due to peer effects, but rather it may have been just changes in the environment. And you know, I have colleagues not in the economics department and not at the business school, but in other parts of Yale that have written some very, very catchy studies about how obesity is contagious. But actually, if you rerun their method, their empirical methods, you also would conclude that acne, headaches, and height are contagious. So it's probably not the best way of really inferring peer effects. So all those challenges of identifying peer effects that the previous panelists already mentioned are present here, but they're kind of amplified because in addition to overcoming the standard causal peer effects, you know, where you sometimes have good data, observational data, where you have to do a ton of like great insights and a couple of like really flashing moments where you have to figure out the idea of how to separate this out. You always need some form of exogenous variation. But in order to now separate out the mechanisms, okay, you're gonna need even more exogenous variation. Because not only do you need to get the causal peer effect first, but you also need an additional source of exogenous variation that allows you to decompose that causal peer effect. Okay? And so what we went into with that project, we really wanted to understand, okay, what are the two main sources at a totally reduced form level? So not thinking about all the different drivers, but saying like, if you just take a simple model, what could be driving peer effects? Okay? The one thing that could be driving peer effects is something is changing in the beliefs. Okay, so something that I think about the quality of a certain product, okay, or the benefits of a particular, my beliefs about the benefits of a particular activity. If that's changing, let's just call that social learning. Okay, I see somebody else using that, I therefore update my beliefs about how good that thing is. Okay, and because I changed my beliefs, okay, that now makes me want to have that thing too. Okay, and that's going to generate the peer effect. The other channel is, no, it's not something in the beliefs, okay, but it's another component of the utility function, i.e. it's directly affecting the utility. Okay? So that could be some social utility, but you can think of it also as some kind of network effect. Okay, where the fact that somebody else has adopted something gives me a higher utility. Okay? Maybe this is in a software context, you could think of it as a network effect in sort of like seeing somebody else drive around in a fancy car. Okay? That would then mean, okay, that's actually changing directly, not how I think about the quality of this thing, okay? But rather how it would directly enter my utility function. Somebody raised their hand, I noticed, and I want to make sure that they have time. I'm going to try and answer questions at the end because I think Johannes, we don't have ways of doing that directly, right?
Yeah, I think what's easier if people type the questions into the Q&A and then we'll like weave them into the panel in the end. I think that's going to be more effective.
Okay, so now the identification is even trickier because you now got to do something to separate those two things. You got to separate the social learning from the social utility. And I think the key insight that we really had for this paper, and that I am pretty proud of that we figured it out as a team of 4, was that we realized that what you can do is you just got to decouple the revealed preference from the possession. Okay, so what is the revealed preference? The real preference part is just that I know that somebody else wants another product. It's not important that he actually have that product. All I need to know is that they wanted that product. Okay, that's enough for me to update my beliefs. What is important for the social utility, the direct effect on my utility, is that they possess this. It's not that they wanted it, but somehow they possess it. Okay, so if I randomly allocated it to them, the social utility channel would be switched on, but the social learning channel wouldn't be switched on. On the other hand, if they want it, but they don't have it, only the social learning channel is switched on, but the social utility channel isn't switched on. Okay. Now, in most situations, okay, unless they involve some form of rationing, it's going to be very hard to decouple that revealed preference from the possession. And that's why we needed a field experiment. So how did we end up running this? We did this in a financial context. Okay, so think of the following situation. You have a new investment opportunity. There's this fund out there called Wingspan. Suppose I observe my financially savvy friend investing in a hedge fund like this one here. I know little about the quality of the hedge fund, but I infer that it might be a good investment. That's social learning. If it's a story like I fear financially falling behind my friend, or I want to keep up my expenditure, okay, relative to her, okay, then that's social utility. Okay. Now, the way I'm pitching you this is like we have this investment opportunity. Okay. The original first idea that we had was a totally different one. Is we were gonna do something with sweaters sold on Bruin Walk at UCLA. Okay, it had none of the financial aspect. Okay, it had none of this sort of like connections to bubbles and asset run-ups and so on. Okay, but when we first pitched that idea, I think it was one of my senior colleagues, Ivo Welch, okay, in finance. He said like, "Yeah, that sounds cute, but who cares?" Or to put it, what Ivo really said, "Who gives a shit?" Okay, so that was that we said, okay, can we still do this type of idea? Okay, but can we do it in sort of like something that seems more relevant? Okay, so then the second thing was I had done a fair amount of work on lab experiments, and I said, okay, if Ivo Welch thinks that this is important, these peer effects, okay, and he thinks that the financial context is better, let's run something along the lines where you can observe a financially savvy friend who knows something about the past returns of an asset, okay, maybe because that person has observed them, okay, and then we differently allocate the assets such that we separate out the social learning and the social utility. Okay, so we ran a simple lab experiment that essentially already had the structure of the experiment that I'm going to show you in a second. Okay? But again, when we ran that, it sort of worked. And then I pitched the idea or the results of that initial pilot to another colleague. Okay? And they said, yeah, that's nice, but that's a lab experiment with MBA students. Okay, nobody is going to care about that. Okay? And of course, I, having done lab experiments, I have dealt with these external validity concerns before, okay? And tried to sort of assuage the concerns of my colleague, but he pretty clearly pointed out that we needed some more realistic setting. Okay, so we didn't go fully to the totally realistic setting of, okay, let's use this with observational data, because we really thought there was no hope of separating out the revealed preference from possession. Okay, so instead we got incredibly lucky. Okay, how did we get incredibly lucky? We just had a connection with an asset management company in Brazil. Okay, it was through the connection of one of my co-authors. Okay, and it turns out they were allowing us to run this crazy field experiment that I'm going to tell you about. And now, in retrospect, okay, almost 8 years later since we did that project, I'm still not entirely clear how we got this past IRB. Okay, although my co-authors have since run some other crazy experiments. Okay, looking at peer effects in under authoritarian regimes, so they have some experience with getting stuff past IRB. Okay, but also how that company ever agreed with us to let us run this thing. So sometimes it's not, you know, as Johannes said, you know, you got to be smart, you got to be clever about things. Often also in research, you just got to be lucky. Okay? And here we got lucky, which is we were able to implement this high stakes field experiment that allows us to identify the overall peer effect in the purchase of a new financial asset. And then we're going to try and disentangle social learning from the social utility. The key ingredient in all this was that we had a lottery that would determine whether individuals who choose to purchase an asset are actually allowed to make the investment. And that lottery then decouples the revealed preference from possession. Now that all sounds extremely abstract. Okay, so let me tell you just how we implemented all of this and how this worked. Okay, so we had, again, some kind of social network structure. It was a super simple one. It just was some information that the company had when they initially signed up clients about how certain clients were related to each other. So they were, it was essentially a referral scheme. They had kept track of the referral scheme, okay? And they knew also from that referral scheme whether somebody was a family member or a friend or a work colleague and so on of the person that they referred. But in some way, those two people were connected. Okay? So these were the related pairs of clients that I identified, and we randomly assigned them to roles of investor 1 and investor 2. Then what happened is we had one of those brokers, okay, and this is mostly done over the phone. This is not internet stuff. It tends to be relatively high net worth individuals. I sometimes joke that this is my development economics paper because it's run in Brazil, but it's really high net worth individuals. So it has nothing to do with the development economics context. We had a situation where the investor 1 then was given the opportunity to purchase an asset without any information about investor 2's choice. So the broker phoned up that investor 1, okay, somebody that they knew already, that they interacted with a ton. They gave them this pitch about this new asset. This asset turned out to be a very, very attractive asset that usually doesn't get sold to all clients. But here, the investor is giving essentially a sales pitch for that asset. What happened then with that investor 1? Well, that investor 1 decides, okay, I'm going to buy this. I will say, yes, I would like to buy this. That's the some accept. Okay. But some of them said, no, actually, I'm not interested in this. Okay. And they decline. Forget for the moment about all the client pairs where the first investor says, I'm not interested. And let's only work with those that say, I accept. Okay. There was then a lottery to receive the asset. So even if you said, yes, I want to purchase this asset, the purchase decision was actually only implemented with some probability. Okay? So some people ended up receiving that asset. Okay? Think of it as some form of ex ante quantity rationing. Okay? Often we see ex post quantity rationing, for example, we know in IPOs, okay, when there's oversubscription, everybody says, I want to have this, okay, but not everybody gets it. Okay? Here, it was an ex ante rationing, okay, where it was clearly described to the clients that, yes, you can get this, but you may not be able to get it. Okay? So some ended up receiving the asset, some of them didn't receive the asset, or to put it more precisely, some of those had their purchase decision implemented, and some of them did not have their asset decision implemented. Then you got an additional lottery. Okay, you got a lottery to receive information. Okay, what about that lottery to receive information? Well, that's all about the second investors. Okay, and so those second investors, that's really now the most interesting part for us. Okay, why? Because those investors, they're going to be grouped in different types of categories. Okay, in condition 1, okay, it's just a control condition where those investor 2s, they get phoned up by the broker gives them the usual sales pitch. Okay, and then the broker says, okay, do you want to buy the asset, yes or no? Okay, they don't get no information whatsoever about what investor 1 did. Unsurprisingly, what's condition 2? Well, condition 2, they get told the same sales pitch, okay? But then they also get told, oh, and by the way, your friend that referred you to us, okay, he wanted that asset, okay? But he wanted the asset, but his purchase decision wasn't implemented. Okay? So there's like a lot of precision that had to go into explaining to the investor 2s, look, the purchase implementation decisions are not correlated in any way. The fact that he didn't get it doesn't mean that you wouldn't get it. And so we had to be extremely precise about that and explain that very clearly, or the brokers had to explain that extremely clearly to the investors. But really what condition 2 is just you get told that your friend wanted it but didn't get it. Okay, so it's only the revealed preference is switched on here, not the possession part. And so then, unsurprisingly, what is condition 3? Well, there, both these revealed preference as well as the possession part is switched on, because those investor 2s were informed that both the investor 1 wanted the asset and was able to purchase it. Okay, So what are we going to do now? Well, from now on, everything is super simple. The only insight of the paper was, okay, let's separate out reveal preference from possession, and let's find a crazy field experiment that allows us to separate those. Okay? Everything that follows now is just literally comparing averages. Okay, there's a little bit of more fancy econometrics, okay, with permutation tests, okay, that tries to check for robustness, but essentially all we're going to do now is compare what is the take-up rate for investor 2 in condition 1, investor 2 in condition 2, and investor 2 in condition 3. Okay? And that's essentially what I'm going to show you next. I'm not going to show you any regression results or any robustness checks. Okay, you can check all of those out in the 80-page paper in Econometrica. Okay? The basic insight of the paper is just that slide that I've just shown you here. Okay. Now, what are the results? Results is that in that control condition, so that condition 1, you get purchase rates for the investor 2s of about 42%. For the investor 2s in the condition 2, okay, where social learning was switched on, okay, but social utility was not switched on, you get take-up rates of about 71%, okay, and you get 93% of purchase rate in that learning plus condition, plus possession condition. Okay, and so what is the effect just of social learning? Well, it's going from 42% to 71%. What is the additional effect of social utility on top of social learning? It's going from 70 to 93%. Okay? Now, does that tell us anything about magnitudes? Okay? No, because they're particularly cooked in some way. Okay? Here in this field experiment, because we needed both a big take-up rate in the first stage, so we didn't in the first investor part, okay, because we couldn't throw away half of the sample or more than half of the sample just by having investor ones that are saying, well, I don't want to invest. Okay? We also needed to ensure that, well, there would be enough take-up effect to increase it. So if we had extremely high take-ups, okay, that would make it difficult too. So running a bunch of pilots here was really, really, really crucial. Yeah? The amount invested is very much in line with the purchase rate. So not only is there effect on the extensive margin, but also on the intensive margin, that as you add learning and as you add possession, okay, you're going to get more larger investments. These are all in terms of reais in there. Now, I think that would have made for a really interesting paper, okay? But I think what we then did really made it a lot better. Okay, so we did two things. Number one is, for what you've seen here so far, I've only shown you investor 2s where the first investor said, yes, I want to purchase. Okay. If I go back to the slide, the previous slide here, so in a sense, you know, in that some decline stuff here, okay, where investor 1 is giving the opportunity and then they say some decline, we were throwing away all of that sample here. Now, we had another condition where, of course, we could still, or where the brokers could still phone up that second investor of those investor pairs where the first investor said, no, I don't want to have the asset. Okay? And we could put them just in the same information condition as condition 1, i.e. not tell them at all what the first investor did. Okay? So they were, again, choosing everything in autarky. They had no idea what their peer person did. Okay? Informationally, that's the same, but of course you get a selection effect here, because you'd expect that the people who are connected to peers who wanted to invest are different or from the people who are connected to the peers that didn't want to invest. Okay? And indeed, we find exactly that selection effect. The take-up rate there for those people of investor 2s who are connected to investor 1s that declined is lower than the 42% there. Okay? So that allowed us now not to just to say, okay, you get the selection effect, going from 35 to 42%. You get the social learning effect going from 42% to 70%. And you get the additional social utility effect when you go then all the way to 90%, to 93%. A couple of things that the company did not want us to do, okay, that we tried to get them to do, but they really then said, no, you're totally crazy. Okay, we're not letting you do that thing. Number one is we wanted to have the broker phone up people where the first investor declined, and then tell that second investor, oh, by the way, your friend declined. Okay, so that will give them negative feedback about what their first investor did. Okay. Now we would have predicted, okay, that negative feedback, that's like social learning again, that should have a negative effect. Okay, when we pitched that to the company, they said, "Are you crazy? We're definitely not doing that." Okay, because we know what's going to happen. People are not going to do that. Okay. The other thing that we pitched to them and said, well, what we're measuring here is when you go from condition 2 to condition 3, it's social utility conditional on there being a social learning effect. Okay? Can we do the social utility effect just in isolation? Okay? So what would that mean? Well, that would mean we just randomly allocate stuff to some people, okay? And then tell them that their friends were randomly allocated those things. Okay? And that would only be social utility without social learning. And again, the company said, like, are you crazy? We're not giving stuff away for free. Okay? So those are things that I would have liked to run, okay, that we also tested a little bit in the experimental lab setting. And then occasionally I think about, well, we could have written up those results too. But I think they have exactly this type of stuff that you'd expect. They're kind of cute and interesting, but they're not, I think, as important as the disentangling here of the social learning and the social utility effect. Okay, then we did something in addition, which is that, okay, a lot of people challenged us and say, well, you know, this social learning stuff, it looks like it, but it could be also like that I particularly want stuff more when I hear that my friend didn't want it. So it's not actually social learning, but it's some kind of another channel of social utility. And so then we went back actually to find out more about these investors, okay, and try to find out more about their financial sophistication. When I teach this to my MBA students, okay, I always tell them, okay, think of different types of investors. Here are 2 different types of investors that I think of. Okay, on the left is my grandmother, who never, like a good Austrian grandmother, never invested in anything else other than a savings account. Okay, so when she made financial decisions, okay, with respect to something, then I probably wouldn't think that that was a particularly well-informed decision. The person on the right is my brother, a classic 1%, a private equity partner in New York, okay, who I try to keep up with, okay, but he of course has lots and lots of insights about how to invest. When he makes a decision, usually there should be a lot of social learning aspect there because he knows exactly what he's doing. So what would be a prediction of a very simple social learning model? Okay, if you're interested in that, that's in an online appendix A, I think, of the published version. We then had the predictions like, well, there's more to learn from a financially sophisticated investor. There should be a significant social learning effect because if I observe what my brother is doing or I hear about my brother wanted to invest in, that has a big informational content. So that should have a big social learning effect. And indeed, that's what we find in the paper. There's less to learn from financially unsophisticated investors like my grandmother. And indeed there we find no significant social learning effect. But you can also reverse this. Okay? It's not just that about the identity of the first investor, okay, whether they are financially sophisticated or financially unsophisticated. Okay? But it could also be about yourself. If you're financially unsophisticated, then you have much to learn. In some sense, you know, the way we model this in the paper is that you think about the precision of the signal that you receive. If you're financially unsophisticated, the signal precision isn't particularly large. Okay? So it's a very imprecise signal. So therefore, you should place a lot of weight on the decisions of others who have much more precise signals. Okay? So therefore, you should see a significant social learning effect. And indeed, that's what we find. Now, let me tell you in the last couple of minutes, and before I run out of time, a few things that I learned along the way about this writing papers. And I've mentioned a few of them along the way. The first one is that your first idea is probably not the best one. In our case, it was trying to sell garments or clothes on the UCLA Bruin Walk and randomly allocating them to friends and friend networks. Okay? That sounded cool, but when we looked at it, it wasn't really that great of an idea. But even if that isn't that great of an idea, it doesn't mean that the paper or the idea isn't worthwhile pursuing. When I teach my MBA students, and so some of them I teach entrepreneurship, and there, you know, we remind them often that if you want to be an entrepreneur, it's okay to fail. The important thing is that you got to fail fast. You got to figure out relatively quickly what works and what doesn't work. Okay, and here I think it's very similar when you run field experiments. Sometimes you got to figure out, okay, what works and what doesn't work, what is worth pursuing and what isn't worth pursuing. Similarly here in this project, what was super important was having the right set of co-authors. Okay, one, because we got incredibly lucky because we got to connect with that asset management company in Brazil, but also because we all have very complementary skills. Okay, the four of us have different degrees of experience of running field experiments. We have different degrees to the extent of how we think about theory, about how we model stuff. Okay, the insights about financial sophistication and so on only really came to us as we thought about these things more. It's also perfectly fine to get negative feedback. Okay, and so sometimes that's the most helpful one. Okay, so the feedback that we received from Ivo Welch back then was incredibly helpful. Okay? It's not necessarily discouraging, and I think in our profession in particular, you need to have an incredibly thick skin, okay, to be okay and be told this what you're doing is garbage. Okay, it's just the most important stuff is to put it aside and just think about, okay, what can I do better about this? Okay, and then the last part, and this is something that I always mention when I do this paper, is that what you see now is, of course, a super finished paper that all looks great, and that also was instrumental in getting two of my courses tenure at Chicago and Berkeley. But the way that we got this paper was with 4 rejections at the top 5 journals. We got rejected at the AER, we got rejected after 2 rounds at the QJE. In fact, we got desk rejected at the AER. We got rejected at the Review of Economic Studies. We got rejected at the JPE. And only when we submitted to Econometrica, where we didn't really think that this was going to have a shot, because it isn't a super technical paper, but we got really great referees. Lots of people had encouraged us along the way and said, look, this is a fabulous paper, you should just keep submitting. And that's what we did. So sometimes, even though it's important to figure out if something isn't good and it's failing, you should just cut your losses. If you're convinced that something is great, the most important thing is to get it in front of people, talk to people about it, and just keep submitting it. Okay, I'm going to end here and look forward to any panel discussion that we have.